Welcome back from the break. Once again, I'm Karen, and I'm a program manager on the Google Earth Outreach team. You're tuned in to the Geo for Good Summit's Climate, Science, and Communication program. Our next session is all about climate justice. This session is a series of 5 lightning talks featuring 5 presenters who are using mapping tools to understand equity and justice issues around climate change and the environment. Our first speaker is Muryel Arantes from Ecam, who will be presenting on a new approach they are developing to support the role of Quilombola communities in addressing climate change. Over to you, Muryel.
Hi, everyone. I am Muryel. I am part of the Ecam team, a Brazilian NGO dedicated to a sustainable development. It's really great to be here again sharing our work, especially what we are doing to deal with climate change together with local communities. Today, as a society, we can say that we have a range of strategies to deal with climate issue on a global level. In this context, the financial mechanisms have been one of the most important instruments to realize climate mitigation actions. But the implementation of these mechanisms are still a huge challenge due to the lack of integration between relevant jurisdictions and stakeholders. But in this case, who are the stakeholders? In my opinion, all of us. No-profit organizations, government and private sectors, and vulnerable communities. Climate change is our problem. But the thing is, people who are vulnerable the most are also those whose the way of life are more sustainable. For example, Quilombola communities in Brazil produce food from a family organization structure. In this system, ancestral land management ensures a low-carbon agriculture and a high variety of food. In this system, it's not necessary to deforest large areas to produce, so that ensures conservation of carbon stocks. Our challenge is to build a community climate platform that allows us to monitor low carbon agriculture and carbon stocks. So the communities can use this data and have a seat at the table where financial mechanisms are discussed. We already have a tested methodology that allows us to do this kind of analysis, but the way we do it today requires a high investment. We have to do all these technical steps and use all these GIS programs. And this is not good if you want to scale this work. We have to optimize the process. That's why we worked with Google Earth Engine associated with Ground to make this work more efficient and accessible, from the data collect in the field to the satellite images analysis. And for me, it feels really great to use just 2 free tools to do this work, and even better to realize that it really works. In the last few months, we worked in order to insert this methodology into a single script within Google Earth Engine. And I'll tell you briefly how the code works. To measure carbon stocks, we identified areas of health vegetation coverage using classifier algorithms within Google Earth Engine. And to train these classifiers, we collect field points through Ground. This is the supervised classification part. After that, we insert functions to calculate area, tons of carbon, and price to be paid per ton. To carry out greenhouse gases balances, we collect very specific data, such as the amount of fuel used in the equipment. And this information is inserted into a standard equation used to calculate the balance of emissions and removals for carbon from each type of crop. Ground has been crucial in collecting all this data because we need a lot of detail from landscape and from agriculture practices. So we need a tool that is easy to use and that brings spatial elements since the beginning of the work. And having this script already done for the communities will bring them autonomy in monitoring their projects. And their carbon projects will be big. The results we've got from the pilot projects are pretty impressive. From just 2 communities, small communities we worked with, we identified 81,368 tons of carbon that could be sold for $407,000. Here, we started to have some material to insert quilombola communities in the financial mechanisms discussions. Thank you so much for having me. We will keep doing this work, so any comments or questions are welcome.
Thank you, Muryel. Our next speaker is Samira Barzin from University of Oxford and the World Bank, who will present her work investigating how the burden of air pollution affects the world's most vulnerable residents. Take it away, Samira.
Thanks, Karen, for the great introduction, and I'm very excited to be here and sharing this exciting work with all of you. The work I'm going to present today is one of the projects I'm working on where we try to bridge the gap between the environmental burden faced in developing countries with also the socioeconomic burden of poverty equally faced in those same set of countries. So the project is titled Pollution and Poverty, to be very direct and very obvious with what we're doing. Now, to quickly talk you through the aim of the project, as mentioned, is to interlink but also separate by analysis the double burden, the one faced by people living in poverty from the poverty itself, but also those that risk faced through the high exposure to environmental parameters such as flooding or drought, but also the increased vulnerability by the reduced inability to recover from those burdens. So what I've quickly visualized here for you is the Climate Vulnerability Index, where you can see which countries are at particularly high risk of any type of environmental factors associated with climate change. And we can really see that the large chunk of this is in sub-Saharan Africa, with, of course, some other countries in Asia and also Latin America. The problem is that the majority of these countries are also countries that do not have reliable and frequent data collection that makes it possible for us to investigate on a quantitative level what is going on. So the overall aim that we're fostering and that we're promoting with this project is the combination of traditional and geospatial data, relying largely also on Google Earth Engine for cloud computing, in order to identify and separate those two burdens, the burden of poverty and the burden of higher vulnerability to environmental pollution. And in particular, we are interested in air pollution and children's mortality. Now, our data strategy, as mentioned, combines traditional data, which is survey data that gives us information on socioeconomic parameters such as income, different assets owned by the household, education level, that we derive from the DHS data. What you can see here on the map are all the locations that we have. So we have about 30 sub-Saharan African countries and about 100,000 locations across the sub-Saharan African region. For the environmental data, we pull data from Google Earth Engine, and here I give you an example of one of the sources we use, which is the carbon monoxide from the Sentinel-5P satellite from the European Space Agency, that we then match based on location. What we then do upon building a large data set, we combine statistical and economic modeling to separate out those two effects, and then we use machine learning to add to the analysis by predicting where is the burden the highest. That is the combined burden of both poverty and environmental pollution in this case, but it can also be other environmental factors. We use the results, particularly those from the machine learning, because the statistical analysis helps us to better understand what is going on, and the machine learning helps us to predict for locations that were not necessarily included in the sample. We can then go out and we know for the whole African continent where is there pollution, because the satellite data is global, and we can then combine that data with external data on poverty that does not allow us to detect it on a household level, but still on a relatively small level, to give information on where is that combined burden the highest. And that in itself is extremely important for better policymaking to ensure that people are not left with the brunt of climate change and also pollution, while also still having to deal with living in poverty. So this project really wants to combine those two elements, the poverty and the climate change or environmental parameters, to shed light on how much of that burden falls on those people that have the least options to be protected or that are the least protected from that burden, to really show that the amount of climate change and the burden of environmental pollution is very hard and very crucial for those countries that are the world's poorest. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks, Samira. Next up is Amber Jean McCullum from NASA Ames Research Center, who will talk about how the Navajo Nation and NASA are teaming up to tackle drought. Over to you, Amber.
Hello, all. My name is Amber McCullum, and I'm an applied scientist for NASA, and I'm located on the traditional lands of the Ohlone people here in Oakland, California. I'm so excited to speak to you today about the Navajo Nation Drought Severity Evaluation Tool that was co-developed by the Navajo Nation Department of Water Resources and the Desert Research Institute. We focused on the water resource and drought management needs of the Navajo Nation shown here. The Navajo Nation is the largest federally recognized sovereign tribe in the United States in total land area of over 70,000 square kilometers and a population of over 200,000. It's located in the Four Corners region of the southwestern U.S. in the states of Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico, and is surrounded by the four sacred mountains. Water is so vital to this community with strong cultural connections. Drought is common, and there are limited ground-based climate data in the region. There are many water supply and drought reporting challenges, with over 40% of homes lacking direct access to running water. Agriculture and livestock management is also of great importance to the nation and can be challenging under these dramatic climate conditions. Given the needs of our partner, the primary goal was to improve drought reporting through the use of NASA data and ground-based data with the user-friendly web application. The aim was to improve the flow of information for drought decision-making, and we needed the tool to be free and open, user-friendly, and a time and storage saver. As this tool was developed, I really want to highlight the community connections and the co-development of the tool. When working with the Navajo Nation, we first established trust. We visited with the community before COVID to have listening sessions with our partners, and we had open dialogue of the needs and potential roadblocks of our work. This set the stage for co-development where we focused on the cultural context and the pre-existing knowledge systems. We then followed this up with trainings, and which were really central to this project. So now I would like to jump into a short demonstration of the tool. So here's the main page of our Navajo Nation Drought Severity Evaluation Tool. When you arrive at the page, you'll be taken to the Navajo Nation. You can also change some features of the map here. Along the top, we can change this to the terrain map, so we can see the outline of the nation a bit better. You can also modify the layers, such as adding the rain gauge stations or looking at the entire Navajo Nation boundary. Along the left-hand panel, we have our options for choosing our variables for different climatologies and hydrology layers. The first thing we'll take a look at is our GridMet Daily, which is a modeled product, precipitation. And we'll take a look at the percent of average conditions over the last northern water years, so from October to September of the last year. When running the climatologies, we actually need to choose 1 day less than the previous year, so we're just going to change this to 9/29 and click on Get Map Layer. Now we can see that this last northern water year was very dry for the Navajo Nation. Much of the area was less than average precipitation conditions. We can also choose this Get Value option and show the actual value at any location on the nation. And we can see here that the rain was about 68% of average. We can also take a look at the drought indices. So if we go ahead and choose our GridMet drought option, we can take a look at the 180-day or 6-month SPI, and we can take a look at this right around the end of June, where the drought declaration was reaffirmed, and click on Get Map Layer. So we can see here that there are portions of the Navajo Nation under exceptional drought conditions. Using this yellow question mark, we can see the comparison to the US Drought Monitor categories. The other great feature of DSET is the ability to make time series. So what we can do is we can compare the precipitation to the SPI using a 2-variable analysis for a specific chapter. In this example, we're going to take a look at the Cameron chapter here. And we'll take a look at the 9 months leading up to that drought declaration. So we'll go ahead and start with our precipitation. And we will go ahead and use our CHIRPS Pentad precipitation, which is another model. And we'll choose a custom date range. And we'll go ahead and look from the September 29th of 2020 to the 29th of June in 2021. And then we'll do the same thing for our second variable, and this will be the GridMet SPI drought index, the 6-month SPI drought. And we just need to make sure by copying and pasting the time that the start date and end date for both of these variables is the same. So we're going to then get the information in a time series format for both of these variables if we click on Get Time Series. So now what we can see is the precipitation in blue and the 6-month SPI in green for just that Cameron chapter. And as we move over the figure, you can see the values actually popping up for each of these variables. We can also download the data as an image or as a CSV. So that is a very brief overview of what DSET can do, and there are many, many more climate variables, hydrology variables, and options for you all to work with here. Thank you.
So I'd like to thank you so much for your time today, and feel free to contact me with any questions.
Thanks, Amber. Next up is Michelle Stolmacher from DePaul University, who will talk about how she used Earth Engine to investigate the contribution of green space to environmental gentrification in Chicago. Take it away, Michelle.
I'm Michelle Stolmacher, an assistant professor at DePaul University, and today I'm going to talk about some of my research on green gentrification in Chicago. So a little bit of context around green gentrification. So there's a lot of research pointing to the numerous benefits of green space in urban areas, whether it's ecological or human health. And so a lot of cities are looking to invest more in their green spaces, whether it's adding new ones or putting more into the existing areas. And there's a special focus lately on areas that have had proportionally less. And research shows that this is often minority or low-income neighborhoods. Investments in green space, however, have been linked to an increased risk of gentrification, and this is called green gentrification or environmental gentrification. And so a lot of scholars have looked at how can we add green space to areas that have had disproportionately less without putting the residents of that area at risk of displacement. And so this is where the idea of just green enough comes in, that there are certain types of investments that will improve green space access without tipping the scale and triggering gentrification. And some of the different types of green space investments that have been proposed to be just green enough are small, disconnected, or informal green space investments. But some of these are more theory-based and haven't been empirically tested, or the results of empirically testing is mixed. So that's what this research looks at. Empirically speaking, do new informal green spaces contribute less to the likelihood of gentrification than new formal green spaces? And do additions of small or spatially disconnected green space contribute less to the likelihood of gentrification? So to answer this, there's a lot of data we need to put together. So first is the area gentrifying. And to look at gentrification, we're using census data between 2010 and 2015. And then we need to know where the green space is, and this is where Google Earth Engine comes in. I'm actually smashing together 2 different research projects in this little presentation. So for one of the research questions, we used Landsat, and for the other, we used NAPE. But for both of them, we calculated a vegetation indice and then selected only the pixels with the highest levels of vegetation, and those become our green space. And then we need to know, are they formal, like park spaces, or informal, like yards and greenways along roads? And so to do that, we used the Chicago metropolitan area planning's land use data set, and then we used landscape metrics to look at the green spaces, size, and connectivity. So we used a logic regression to determine how each variable contributed to the likelihood that a census tract would gentrify. And in the interest of time, what I've got here is just the ranked variable importance output from the logic regression. And then I've also noted which variables are statistically significant with the blue bars, as well as the direction of their relationship. And the main thing to take away from this is that green space change doesn't show a very strong relationship with the likelihood of gentrification. In fact, it's one of the lowest ranked variables, and instead above it, we see a lot of the more common risk factors for gentrification, like the housing stock in the area. The second research question looks at the size and shape of green space change. And here we do find that green space patches with greater connectedness was more likely to be linked to gentrification, but we don't see that for a different measure of connectedness that looks more at the green space network or for the increasing mean green space size. So in conclusion, we found evidence for the idea that connected green space is more likely to trigger gentrification, but we didn't see as much of a risk in the difference between formal versus informal or large versus small changes. Often non-green space related neighborhood characteristics were more important. So our key takeaway is that future green investments should consider the pre-existing risk factors for gentrification instead of being concerned about adding any green space at all. And so in future work, I'm both going to dig in at the local level and want to scale up. So we have a grant to work with community members in Pilsen. This is a neighborhood in Chicago that has been underserved in terms of green space, but has been seeing and combating a lot of gentrification lately. So we'll provide this data on green space to them, which they'll use to have a conversation about what types of green space would best serve their community and kind of fit that just green enough approach. And then, of course, I'm interested in seeing if any of the trends we saw in Chicago also exist in other cities. So in the future, I'd like to scale up the analysis to other cities in the US or around the world.
Thank you, Michelle. Our final speaker in this session is Rona Cox from Williams College, who will talk about how she has used Earth Engine to quantify the rising waters and sinking lands of Native American tribal lands in southern Louisiana. Over to you, Rona.
Hi, thanks for that introduction, and it's a great honor to be here. And I want to talk about rising waters and sinking lands and how land loss is affecting Native American groups in southern Louisiana. The Mississippi River Delta, shown here in the red circle, is one of the lowest lying parts of the United States in this topographic map that's color-coded for elevation. And we're going to zoom in now, and on the left-hand side, you can see a scale bar that shows elevations, and all those blue colors are ones that are really close to sea level. And you can see that substantial portions of southern Louisiana around New Orleans and further south are in these dark blue colors that are at 0 meters, or even in some cases, -1 meters relative to sea level. And here's what that looks like on the ground. And those areas that are mapped as being below sea level, although they're within the state of Louisiana, are areas that were actually solid ground in living memory. So here there's a strip of land with a road and some houses, but all of that blue open water on either side of this community was farmland within the memory of people living there now. The people living in this area, as opposed to the people who have houses where they go to vacation, the people who actually live there year-round, are mostly impoverished, and they are absolutely at the frontiers of climate change, and in many cases on the verge of disaster. And this image here from the Washington Post shows some of the impacts of Hurricane Ida last month. We're going to focus on 3 American tribal groups, Native American groups, the Grand Kaiu Dulac Band of Biloxi, Chitimacha, Choctaw, the Ponashan tribe, and the Ile de Jean Charles Band, all of whom live on the Delta. The land loss issues in southern Louisiana are in part due to sea level rise, which is causing coastal erosion everywhere. But in this particular region, it's subsidence of the delta's land surface that's the main issue. And that's what gives you this sort of lace-like mixture of land and water that is well inland of the mapped coastline. And in part, it's a natural process, but it has been greatly accelerated in the last half century or so by human impacts. And it's very well studied. And I'm going to flip back and forth here in this image that shows today versus in 1960. And you can see how much land has been lost. It has been famously equated to about a football field every 100 minutes. On average, it's not a continuous process, it's quantized. And it's about 3% of land is lost every year, again, on average, some years more than others. We're going to focus on 3 native tribes, and the outlines here are the tribal areas of the 3 groups that I mentioned previously. Natives were pretty much shoved into this area in the 18th century when the Acadians moved down from Canada. Those are the people we now call the Cajuns, and they displaced natives living in that area. There are a number of different groups. 5 of them have state but not federal recognition. We're going to be talking about 3. And in all cases, these are communities who've had minimal access to education, very high dropout rates and non-completion rates for high school, median household incomes, average annual household incomes on the order of $7,000 per household. So these are really marginalized communities geographically and societally. And they are also living at or near the lowest elevations that we mentioned. And these 3 dots here show the areas of those tribal zones. We used Google Earth Engine to ask the fundamental question, are these people losing lands at higher rate than the region as a whole? And my collaborators, Sam Roy and Devon Parfait, and I analyzed satellite imagery over a 32-year period, where we took 3-year cloud-free composites, which we corrected for variations in solar radiance and so on. There's a lot of data here. We're going to be just looking at the oldest in the 1980s and the most recent now. And we used color band combinations to show where there was land and where there was water, and then made binary images that we could get data from. The rates of change for each group look like this. For Ponashan, 70% of the area was land in the 80s, 65% is land now. They've lost land at about 3% per year. The Grand Cayudulac Band have lost more than 25% of their land area at a rate of 0.8% per year. And for Ile de Jean Charles, the land loss rate has been over 1% per year. If we compare this back to the regional average, which is 0.3% per year, we can clearly see that native peoples in this area are experiencing greater than background rates of land loss, which is a shocking example of environmental inequity being suffered by these people. Storms come into this region and make things worse, and this again is Hurricane Ida from just last month. These tribal communities were completely devastated and hundreds remain homeless. This is the home of the chief of one of these tribes. And I'm going to close with saying that we are trying to raise money to alleviate the problems that they are suffering at the moment. And the QR code here will take you to a donation site.
Thanks, Rona, and all of our speakers in the session today. Really exciting work, you guys. We're now going to move to our live Q&A session, and I'm here with Muryel, Samira, Amber, Michelle, and Rona. Hi, guys.
Hi there.
Great to see you all live here. You can tell it's live because it's getting very dark where I am. Thank you all for staying with us to this last session of the day. It's probably dark where you are, or it's early morning if you're in Asia Pacific region. Thanks for being here. During the presentations you guys just watched, you've been asking great questions, and we're excited to get started answering them now. It's not too late if you have a question that's been burning inside of you while you've been listening. Just go below this watch video and you can see the Q&As there, and you can type in your question and we'll get it answered by our panelist speakers. Okay, let's get to our first question. The first question that I see is for Amber from Barrett. Could the drought evaluation tool be used in other areas? Is it replicable?
Thank you. That's a great question. And the short answer is yes. All of the NASA data, as well as the model data available on Climate Engine, is global. So you could run these analyses anywhere in the world that you're interested in. However, I will say that we worked really closely with our Navajo Nation partners to include things like their administrative boundaries, their agencies that are similar to US states, their chapters that are similar to US counties, in order to do some of these calculations. So yes, it's replicable in different regions, but I would really strongly suggest working closely with the community that you'd want to do this work in. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Amber. And thanks, Barrett, for that question. And I see it's similar to, or her answer kind of segued nice to your next question, which we'll get to in a minute. But first, the next question is from Andy for Michelle. Are new formal green spaces correlated with other gentrification factors? For example, if a neighborhood gets a new park, is it also likely to get new businesses, luxury homes, etc.? What do you think?
Yeah, so this really depends on the kind of green space and how that green space was added. So, for example, here in Chicago, we have a Rails to Trails that was put in through some fairly wealthy neighborhoods and then some less wealthy neighborhoods, and we saw massive gentrification at the end of the trail because there was such a big gap across those neighborhoods. So people moved to the area because it was close to the trails and also close to this very wealthy neighborhood. So I'm working on a grant in Pilsen where we're gonna try and make sure that any green space that does get added to this neighborhood, because it's one that's historically been fairly underserved by green space, is the kind of green space that would benefit the community the most. And so that's what the research points to, is that the more the community is engaged in their greening, whether it's green space or environmental remediation or any sort of kind of green improvement, that the more the community is involved, the more it's an improvement that they want, the less likely you are to see that gentrification, because all sorts of different kinds of green space can trigger other factors that then trigger gentrification.
Yeah, I can imagine. And your answer also pointed towards the importance of working with the communities that are in the places, that you guys are studying and building solutions for. I wanted to move to the next question, which Barrett asked to Rona, but I think it's really applicable to everyone. But I'm going to start with Rona, and then I would love to hear from others if you guys have anything to add. Were the people living in the areas where you were working consulted and included while doing the analysis? How did you present the data to them, and did they believe what you presented?
It's a great question, and it's so important to work with local people and the inhabitants of any area where you're doing scientific research, I think. Chief Cheryl Parfait Dar, who is the chief of the Grand Kaiu Dulac Band of Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw, has been a friend and colleague for quite a while, and she was completely on board with all of this work and very enthusiastic about it, and helped arrange for us to get the tribal boundary areas precisely mapped. In fact, the collaborator, the Sampiria Roy, who helped a lot, but also the student, Devon Parfait, who's working on this, is actually a tribal member. And he was in community college in Louisiana, and we were able to get him to transfer to Williams College, where he's now a senior geoscience major. So there's been a lot of deep collaboration. We've presented the data at meetings. We have given these to the tribe. as PowerPoint slides and images that they can bring to meetings and use to advocate for themselves as they try to work towards sustainable policies that engage and acknowledge their rights and positions in this area.
Incredible. Thank you. I mean, I think that all of you guys could talk more about this question. I wanted to go to Muryel. And Muryel, I would love to hear from your work that you presented, how Ecam, or you personally, but how also Ecam works with, engages, and consults and co-designs with the Quilombolas. Can you give us an example?
For us, working with communities is the most important part of our job. So we started a new idea or something new always together with the community leaders. So we work very closely to them.
Thank you. That's incredible. I mean, I'm familiar with a lot of your guys' work, and yeah, whether it's indigenous communities, Quilombola, the capacity building is also a big part of your collaboration. So wonderful. For Amber from Barrett, and then I'll move into some other questions as well. But Amber, there's a question from Barrett about the response of the communities after having access to the drought evaluation tool. Is it possible? And he also wants to get in contact with you and trade information at some point.
Yeah, great question. And of course, I would love to speak more about this, so I can share my contact information as needed. And it's a great question. And we worked, as Rhonda said, it's really important to work with the community directly. And so we worked with the Navajo Nation Department of Water Resources in the design and the development of the tool. And we really wanted to include features that they would actually use in their drought reporting and map making and decision making. So recently, in June of this year, the Navajo Nation had a declaration of a drought emergency, and the tool was used to make maps to present to the Navajo Nation president, to their tribal council, and to their Commission on Emergency Management. So it was really useful in identifying regions, especially in the southwestern portion of the nation, that were undergoing severe drought in order to get the resources sent to those regions that really need it most.
Thank you so much. And I hear Amelia in the background. They're having fun too. She's trying to get her answer in, right? Thank you so much, Amber. Samira, I want to go to you next. I love the work that you did combining socioeconomic data with pollution data from satellite imagery at a global scale. And I was wondering, have you ever thought about combining, including health data? And if so, what are some of the challenges that arose or may arise? Just curious if you've thought or have tried doing that.
So the data that we use actually includes a few health-specific metrics, such as birth weight, some parameters related also to lung function. The point of this specific project was more on the poverty side. So can we separate out the increased vulnerability that the population has to pollution because they're poor, so they might be less able to shield themselves just because they're poor. And then there's also the pure effect from the pollution. So can we really separate out what is due to poverty and what is due to just increased levels of pollution because possibly people live in areas where pollution is higher? Because we work in developing countries, we're very much bound by the data that is there, and we don't have the luxury to have a wish list of the data that we would like. Because we work with information at the household level, which is unfortunately something that is not yet possible with satellite imagery to look inside the houses. We kind of stop at roofs, which is quite great compared to what the data was 10 years ago. But for the household data that we use, we're very much still constrained by the data that is there, and which is very little. And there's, apart from the data that we use, there's not many alternatives. So while there are many things that we would like to do, there's not many things that we can do just because the data is not there. And that is really our largest constraint, that we are, when working in data sparse environments such as developing countries, you have to make the best in a very pragmatic manner of the data that is existing, and you cannot really go and say, this is what I would like to do, but it's more of looking at the data and thinking, what is the best that I can do with the data that is available.
Awesome. Yeah, you're right. I would love to go to you at the end and kind of ask, are there any data sets that exist, but that you haven't been able to get into Earth Engine? Because at a global scale, I imagine there might be. So yeah, we can talk about that maybe a little later. I see a question in the queue from Barrett for Muryel. Do the Quilombolas speak the same language as indigenous peoples in Brazil? And that brings up, I guess, a follow-up question is maybe the difficulties in working in communities that maybe speak different languages, and what kind of challenges or opportunities do arise there. What has been your experience, Muryel?
Quilombola communities speak Portuguese, and indigenous communities depends on the ethnia. So there are a lot of different languages. But Quilombola all speaks Portuguese.
Okay.
I'm not sure if I understood very well.
No problem. No problem. Yeah. So I'm curious from Michelle. I have a question. When I first reviewed your study, you used a city-authored data set to tell the difference between formal and informal green spaces in Chicago. And this might make it a little harder to scale up to cities across the globe because that data is so local, right? Because the city produced it. Do you have ideas of how you could potentially scale this kind of data set in other ways?
Yeah, this is actually,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about this and how data availability really affects it. Like, I got a revise and resubmit on this paper this week, and they asked for the opposite. Like, can you make it more specific?
Oh.
But it really depends on data availability, what you can do.
Yeah.
And so, especially for the global, something I'd be interested in looking at is with a lot of, like, for example, the data set that's kind of come out, Dynamic Earth, with the
Dynamic World,
Dynamic World, yes. With the increasing availability of having these constantly updated land use, land cover data sets, we could at least get a sense of where the green space is. So we might not be able to tell if it's formal or informal, but we could find out, like, if there's going to be different levels of development, if it's, you know, in a city center or more in the fringes, and get a sense for that type of green space from land use, land cover.
That makes sense. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. I think we have time for maybe one last question. I have for Rona. Hurricane Ida, which you mentioned in your talk, did, of course, tremendous damage less than 2 months ago. And are there ways that your Google Earth project can map new land loss resulting from Ida and other recent storms? And how could this potentially help inform policy there?
Yes, so this is one of the nice things about having this baseline set of data that we've created now, and a set of land loss numbers, is that we can take this and take the methodologies that we've developed using Google Earth Engine, and then simply generate more composite images and do comparative analysis. So it'll be fairly straightforward. The land loss that happens right after a hurricane isn't usually final. Sometimes more land gets lost over time. Sometimes some land that's initially lost gets restored as sediment moves around. So it's important to get in sort of early, and then also to track that over time. But there's enough satellite coverage now, and the engine is so powerful that we can do this. And then, of course, just making sure that those data are easily transferable in formats that can be shared easily across both science and out to the tribal members themselves, so that they can share with policy members. I think that will be very powerful. And I'm a huge fan of image-based analysis, not just for data, but we're very visual people. And so, So I think sharing pictures and Google Earth Engine is great.
Yeah, seeing is believing, right? Yeah. Thank you so much to our entire panelists. I know we're out of time. I wish we could keep asking more questions, but of course we can talk after this as well. This marks the end of the Climate Science and Communication program. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you to our panelists today. The next summit program is the APAC Hour, which starts in about 6 hours, where you can tune in for more speakers. From me and everyone here, have a great summit, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.